We have an audience.
We do. Thank you, Stuart. This short presentation is the second part of our discussion on piping in Scotland in the 17th century. You began with a tune I think most of us will be familiar with.
Yeah.
It dates to the 17th century, I take it.
Yes, thanks James. One of the points I tried to make in part one was that the older musical repertoire of the Highland bagpipe and that of the Lowland bagpipe, they suited each other. One of the tunes I played in part one was a Rock and a Wee Pickle Tow, or the Roke as it's sometimes called, which is the town tune of Linlithgow. It has a musical relationship with Cock of the North, and which is obviously a well-known tune and played commonly these days by Highland pipers in particular. So I thought I would begin by playing those two, just so as to link musically from part one. Cock of the North is obviously, I think we know it, it's the nickname of the 4th Duke of Gordon. He's known as the Cock of the North, and that was in the 1790s he got that nickname. But it derives from an English tune actually, Joan's Placket is Torn. A fiddle tune, I think. A fiddle tune, I think. First published in the 1680s, but referred to from before that time. I think it's mentioned in Samuel Pepys's diary sometime in the 1660s, but there's an unproven story that a trumpet version of the tune was played at the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587, and at some point the tune's transformed into what we hear today. There's a suggestion that it's an English tune that can transform into a Scottish tune that's transformed into an English tune. We'll never know, and it doesn't really matter.
Interesting. There was something you said in part one that I just wanted to revisit briefly, as some people have commented on it. It was that the bellows pipes, the Lowland pipes, were played all over Scotland. It was a civic thing.
Yeah, that's right. And quite a long-held role as well. For example, as far back as 1487, Edinburgh, the town of Edinburgh, employed 3 town pipers, or public pipers, whatever you want to call them. The civic records show pipers employed all around Scotland in the Lowlands, in places such as Dumbarton, Perth, Dalkeith, Brechin, Aberdeen, Galashiels, Rothesay, Wigton, Keith, Glasgow, Kilbachan, Dundee, the aforementioned Linlithgow, and so on, everywhere. Perth, in fact, had employed a town piper as late as 1831, and the civic records show that he played through the town at 5 o'clock in the morning and 7 o'clock at night. Yeah. So these pipers, these borough pipers, town pipers, what they call them with the Lowlands, they usually held life appointments, and quite a number of the Kirk records at the time show them getting into trouble for things like playing on the Sabbath and worse.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that. You just go through the records.
And you mentioned in part one the role was clearly quite a functional role within society in those days.
Yes, it was utterly functional. And the instrument itself was probably, well, I say this, and I've spoken to pipe makers about this as well. The instrument itself in those days was probably louder than what you heard there a few moments ago. It's probably louder because it's been used back then outdoors. I think they were probably as loud as the Great Highland bagpipe.
Wow.
Although we'll come to it later on, the concept of a Great Highland bagpipe in the 17th century is maybe a bit loose, a bit fanciful, but we'll come to that. The Highland pipers, their role was functional as well, to play music for the local clan society events, compose tunes to recall past battles, laments on the deaths of notable people, salute to the local gentry, clan gatherings, and so on, and to play music to incite men to kill other men, the brosnaka. Sometimes we should be wary of tune titles, especially from that period, but if we look at the tunes from the 17th century itself, you find tunes like the Clan Campbell's Gathering, MacGregor's Gathering, the Gathering of the MacDonalds of Clanranald, the Battle of Glenfruin, the Battle of Eldern, the MacLeod's Salute, the MacDonald's Salute, laments for people, MacSwan of Roig, Ian Gareth MacLeod of Rassay, James MacDonald of the Isles, Rory MacLeod, lament for Donald of Lagan, Mary MacLeod, the Skye poet, laments, so that type of thing, and lament for the departure of King James, which in Gaelic is called Shule Hamish, and of course there's a lament for James Graham of Claverhouse himself, born in Dundee, a lovely tune called The Lament for the Viscount of Dundee, because he was made a Viscount shortly before, and so they date, that tune there dates to the later part of that century. So the role of pipers and the instrument itself today is completely different. It's become one of performance rather than a functional role. Although there is still a smaller functional role in places like the British Army and armies of other countries, of course. But as I indicated in part one, the picture nationally, Scottish-wide, is that at this period there are more Lowland pipers than there were Gaelic-speaking Highland pipers, and this is the case until well into the 18th century.
Wow.
Actually, a friend of mine, historian Keith Sanger, who you've met,
Yep.
but a decade ago he tried to work out the numbers, or put an estimate on the number of Lowland pipers and Highland pipers in Scotland at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th. It's a very difficult thing to do, mainly because trying to work out population figures before the 19th century census is really guesswork. So Keith, first of all, he went through Webster's account of the number of people in Scotland in 1755, which was a study of population, not a census, but it proved to be valuable in helping Keith work backwards half a century to arrive at an estimate. That's all you can do. So in 1755 you find a population in Scotland of 1.265 million approximately. England at that time has got a population about 5 times as large. That would give England a population of about 6.225 million. And added to Scotland, that's a total of 7.4, almost 7.5 million people. The population is more evenly spread, of course, and the Gaelic speaking population was just over half So Keith used various other statistics and records as well. So, cut a long story short, he's extrapolated that Scotland's population in 1717, so just after the period, was roughly 1.1 million, with the Highlands having a third of that figure. This implies that there would have been twice as many Lowland Pipers as Highland, so twice as many.
I find that incredible, really, because we think of the Battle of Killiecrankie in 1689, and this is just after the Battle of Killiecrankie.
Yeah.
And the battle was really about the two cultures in Scotland, the Lowland culture and the Highland culture. So they were actually very evenly spread from these figures.
Well, when you, I'll just pick it up here. When people today call the Great Highland Bagpipe Scotland's national, in inverted commas, instrument, it's a modern concept, and in the 17th century, this is the national. This is the bagpipe that's more commonly played overall. So, or something like this form of bagpipe, pretty much like this, maybe louder, as I said earlier. But although the concept of a national instrument in those days would have been an odd one, because Scotland wasn't really a united country, even by then. But contemporary references indicate that the Highland pipe here, the Lowland pipe there, I'll play the Highland pipe later on, these are the two forms of bagpipe in Scotland. Both of them acquired a quasi-military function as well. So by formal military function, so that by 1649 you can see in the records there's even rates of pay for the pipers in some of the regiments that have been raised. There's rates of pay laid down by the Scottish Parliament, although there was little in the way of a standing army until later in the century.
So these pipes in the army at that time, would they have been Highland pipes or Lowland pipes?
Well, the concept, you see, even in the 17th century, the concept of a Highland pipe and a Lowland pipe, there's too much of a crossover. There is no standardised bagpipe, really, even by the 17th, as late as the 17th century.
Fascinating.
When you look, I mean, even when you look into the next century, as late as 1746, after the Jacobite Rising, you go to the visitor centre at Culloden, and you'll see a Highland bagpipe, but it's only got two drones. There is no bass drone. Now we know that some parts of Scotland, their bagpipes had two drones gone into a common stock, the same way as this Lowland pipe is in a common stock. Other bagpipes in the Highlands have got the two drones get into different stocks. You see, there's no commonality, there's no standardisation. The standardisation came much later, not in the period that we're talking about. As I say, even the Lowland pipes, but you know, the Lowland pipers were technically they were employed by the boroughs, the towns, but they could still serve a local laird or individual and be paid. Whereas the Highland pipers were patronised by gentry, chiefs, lairds, within a virtually cashless society.
Yeah, fascinating.
There's no boroughs or towns in the Highlands at this period.
Yeah, fascinating. None. I suppose it was just clan territories.
Well, even here where we are right now, this is Atholl. At that period, there's not that period. We'll just come out of the 17th century for just now, because even in Atholl there's a distinct scarcity of pipers. Any piper, right through into the late 18th century. The 77th Atholl Highlanders, for example, was raised for the conflict in America, and in its first muster roll, 1778, its required complement of pipers was stated as, quotes, wanting. They tried to recruit pipers far and wide, as far as Skye, I believe, but by 1781 they had resorted to asking old John McGregor of Glen Lyon to quote, train 4 promising boys. Now whether anything came of that we don't know, as the regiment was disbanded the following year. You know, these McGregors of Glen Lyon were a well-known family of pipers and storytellers for generations.
Yeah, fascinating. You mentioned the martial aspect of the Highland bagpipe in part one. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, this whole period, 17th century, it's one of warfare, raiding, skirmishes among clans, although probably no more or less than any other time in history. And the piper's role was to, as I've said, to sound gathering tunes, remember important events, battles, commemorate or lament the dead. We think that more often than not, the pipers did not tend to be involved in the fighting, but rather to incite and so on. And interestingly, there's a reference in the account later on of the Battle of Falkirk in 1746, where the Jacobite army failed to consolidate victory because the pipers had thrown away their pipes and gone in with the sword. There was no continuation of the excitement, the momentum was lost. In the 17th century, in the civil war between the Scottish Covenanters and Charles I's royalists, pipers are known to have fought. The 8th Earl of Argyll raised a regiment of foot in 1639, and that was the mould for the Scots Guards regiment. It served for 7 years in Ireland to control the rebellion there. In 1648, pipers and drummers are listed in the regiments. And then later on, 1678, a clan battle near Wick between Campbells and Sinklers. A Campbell piper is actually mentioned by name, Finlay MacIver from Glenlyon. We know that later on in 1682, the Foot Regiment, commanded by Charles Erskine, the Earl of Mar, had 3 pipers, but it isn't stated in the records whether they were Lowland or Highland pipers. At this period, we also find an early record of piping in a body of Scottish soldiers in Argyllshire under the Laird of Macnaghten. I think this is about 1627, when he sent a contingent of 200 bowmen to France to defend Protestantism. They sailed from Loch Kerrin, which is modern day Campbelltown. Pipers and harpers were included, but the 2 pipers' presence would have gone unremarked had they not rallied spirits during a dangerous confrontation with a French warship.
Can you tell us more about the status of the Highland pipers at this period?
The military status of the piper is unofficial, and that was the case all over Europe. It seems that the piper's position was between officer and man. Generally, a piper would be allowed to each company, and the captain would maintain him out of his own pocket. And while officers and foot soldiers were paid, albeit sometimes irregularly, piper's allegiance to his chief or the tacksman was binding enough for him to take his chances in his superior's chosen wars. Clearly, this could only work if the piper already had status in his own society, sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, a rent-free status too. The English, French and German armies of the 1670s may have been the model for this supernumerary classification for pipers. This gentleman of the company, who although he marched and watched with arms, didn't for the most part fight. And what we should bear in mind is the Highland regiments were Gaelic institutions reflecting its social system.
Yeah, you mentioned some of these pipers are listed in the regiments during the Civil War between the Scottish Covenanters and Charles I's Royalists. Can we identify them?
Not really. It's fairly rare to hear of the identities of these pipers, their names. The records contain the names of chiefs, lairds, captains and other officers. Pipers' names are quite rare, but we can stitch together what we do know from elsewhere. For example, here at the Battle of Killiecrankie in 1689, we have a written account in the days and weeks before the battle by James Graham's cousin, a guy called James Philip, a classical scholar, a poet who was with him throughout the campaign. He described the raising of the standard on Dundee Law in the spring of that year, followed by the travels up and down the country and across the Rannoch Moor into Loch Aber to meet up with the Camerons, the MacDonalds of Glengarry, the MacDonalds of Clonranald, Glencoe, Keppoch, Stuarts of Appin, McNeils, McLeods, McGregors. Then the total was about 2,000 men, and James Philip wrote that each clan brought its piper, and some brought a bard as well. After a week they marched off with the pipes and bugles playing, and the next day near Aviemore, 29th of May, they celebrated the anniversary of the restoration of Charles II with piping and dancing. So that's all in his account. Subsequently they made their way south, and we know what happened here when they reached Killiecrankie. We know that Cameron O'Lougheil's piper at this period was a chap called Alan Cameron, so it's safe to assume that he was here in 1689. We know that the Clan Maclean made up a large part of the Jacobite force, and three of their pipers during this period were fairly well known: Patrick McNeill Roy, John McWilliam and Condolly Rankin. So it's highly likely that they would have been on the field here, and so on. From what we know, the government forces involved here, they were not likely to have had any pipers with them. Fife and drum, yes, but not pipers. Certainly not Highland pipers.
Yeah, really interesting.